Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and we are back with more Insurgent Mexico. We are coming down to the end of the book. But yeah, we are in the last part here. Let's go ahead and just hop into this. Part 6, Mexican Nights. And it begins its first chapter. If I can separate the pages. El Cosmopolita. El Cosmopolita is Chihuahua's fashionable gambling hell. It used to be owned by Jacob Latouche, the Turk, a fat, shambling man who came to Chihuahua barefooted with a dancing bear 25 years ago and became many times a millionaire. He owned an extravagant residence on the Paseo Bolivar, which was never called anything but the Palace of Tears, because it was built with the proceeds of the Turks' gambling concessions, which ruined many families. But the wicked old man slunk away with Mercado's retreating federal army, and when Villa came to Chihuahua, he gave the Palace of Tears to General Ortega as a Christmas present and confiscated El Cosmopolita. Having a few idle pesos from my expense account, we used to frequent El Cosmopolita. Johnny Roberts and I stopped on our way from the hotel to take a few hot Tom and Jerry's at a Chinese bar, run by a hoary Mongolian named Chi. From there, we proceeded to the gambling tables with the leisurely air of Russian Grand Dukes at Monte Carlo. One entered first a long, low room lighted with 3 smoky lanterns where the roulette game was. Above the table was a sign which read, "Please do not get on the roulette table with your feet." It was a vertical wheel, not a horizontal one, bristling with spikes, which caught flexible steel strip and finally stopped the wheel opposite a number. Each way the table extended 12 feet, always crowded with at least 5 rows of small boys, peons, and soldiers, excited and gesticulating, tossing a rain of small bills on the numbers and colors, and arguing violently over the winnings. Those who lost would set up terrible screams of rage as the croupier raked their money into the drawer, and often the wheel was quiet for 3/4 of an hour while some player who had lost 10 cents exhausted his vocabulary upon the treasurer and the owner of the place and his ancestors and descendants 10 generations each way, and upon God and his family for allowing such injustice to go unpunished. Finally, he would take himself off, muttering ominously, "A ver, we shall see," while the others would sympathetically make way for him, murmuring, "Ah, que mala suerte." Near where the croupier sat was a worn place in the cloth, with a small ivory button in the center, and when anyone was winning largely at the wheel, the croupier would press this little button which stopped the wheel where he wished, until the winner was discouraged from playing further. This was looked upon as a perfectly legitimate by all present, since, caramba, there is no sense in operating a gambling house at a loss. The most amazing diversity of money was used. Silver and copper had long been forced out of circulation in Chihuahua because of revolutionary hard times, but there was still some Mexican bank bills. Besides those, there was fiat money printed on ordinary writing paper by the Constitutionalist Army and worth nothing. Scrip issued by the mining companies. IOUs, notes of hand, mortgages, and 100 different voles of various railroads, plantations, and public service corporations. But the roulette table did not long interest us. There was not enough action for your money. So we shouldered our way into a small room, blue with smoke, where a perpetual poker game was going at a fan-shaped baize-covered table. At a little recess at the straight side of the table sat the dealer. Chairs were distributed around the circumference where the players sat. One played against the bank, the dealer scraping into the drawer a tenth of every pot, the house's commission. Whenever anyone began to plunge and displayed a large wad, the dealer would give a shrill, penetrating whistle, and two suave gentlemen who were employed by the house would come running and take a hand. There was no limit as long as you had chips, or if your stack was underlaid with bank bills. The gentleman in possession of the buck had to say whether it was to be draw poker, cerrado, or stud, abierto. Stud was the most fun because a Mexican can never realize that the next card would not give him a magnificent hand, and he bet increasing amounts on every card, with wildly growing excitement. The strict rules of the American game, which so restrict freedom of action, were absent there. Johnny and I would lift the corner of our cards as soon as they were dealt, to show each other, and when I seemed to be drawing ahead, Johnny would impulsively push his whole stack over to me, and the next card, Johnny's hand would seem to have more promise than mine, and I would push both stacks back to him. By the time the last card was dealt, all the chips would be laying neutrally between us, and whoever had the best hand bet our entire joint capital. Of course, nobody objected to this way of playing, but to offset it, the dealer would whistle shrilly to the two house players and slyly deal them each a hand off the bottom of the pack. Meanwhile, a Chinaman would be dashing madly between the table and the lunch counter across the street, bearing sandwiches, chili con carne, and cups of coffee to the players, who ate and drank loudly during the game and spilled coffee and food into the jackpot. Occasionally, some player who had traveled extensively in foreign lands got up and walked around his chair to dispel a run of bad luck, and or asked for a new deck with an offhand expensive air. The dealer would bow politely, sweep the deck into his drawer, and produce another one. He had only 2 decks of cards in the house. Both were about a year old and largely decorated with the meals of former players. Of course, the American game was played, but there would sometimes enter a Mexican who was not intimately acquainted with the subtleties of the American deck. In the Mexican deck, for example, the 7, 8, and 9 spots are omitted. One such person, a pompous, pretentious Mexican, sat in one night just as I had called for a hand of stud. Before the dealer could whistle, the stranger had produced a great wad of money, all sorts, sizes, and denominations, and bought 100 pesos worth of chips. The game was on. I drew 3 hearts in rapid succession, secured Robert's pile, and began to play for a flush. The stranger gazed at his cards for a long time as if they were new to him. Then he flushed the deep red of intense excitement and pushed in $15. With the succeeding card, he turned quite pale and pushed in $25. And when he looked at his last card, he turned red again and bet $50. By some miracle, I had filled a flush, but the man's wild betting scared me. I knew that a flush was good for almost anything in stud poker, but I couldn't keep up with that pace, so I passed the bet to him. He rose at that and protested violently. "How do you mean, pass the bet?" he cried, shaking both fists. It was explained to him, and he subsided. "Very well, then," he said. "Since this $15 is all I have, and you will not let me buy any more chips, I will bet everything," and he pushed it into the center. I caught him. "What have you got?" he almost screamed, leaning, trembling all over the table. I spread out my flush. With an excited laugh, he banged the table a great blow. "Straight!" he cried, and turned up 4, 5, 6, 10 jack. He had already reached out an arm to gather the money when the entire table burst into a clamor. "It is wrong. It is not a straight. The money belongs to the gringo." He lay sprawled out on the table with both arms round the pot. "How?" he cried sharply, looking up. "It is not a straight. Look here. 4, 5, 6, 10 knave." The dealer interposed. "But it should have been a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, he said. "In the American pack, there are 7, 8, and 9. "How ridiculous!" sneered the man. "I have played cards all my life, and never have I seen a 7, 8, or 9. By this time, most of the roulette table throng had swarmed in at the door. They added their clamor to ours. "Of course it is not a straight." "Of course it must be. There is not 4, 5, 6, 10. Is there not 4, 5, 6, 10 knave?" "But the American pack is different." "But this is not the United States. This is Mexico." "Hey, Pancho!" shouted the dealer. "Go at once and notify the police." The situation remained the same. My opponent still lay upon the table with the jackpot in his arms. A perfect pandemonium of argument filled the place. In some cases it had developed a personal note, and hands were stilling to hips. I unobtrusively pushed my chair against the wall. Presently the chief of police arrived with 4 or 5 gendarmes. He was a large, unshaven man whose mustaches twisted up to his eyes, dressed in a loose, dirty uniform with red plush epaulets. As he came in, everybody began explaining to him at once. The dealer made a megaphone out of his hands and shouted through the din. The man on the table turned up a livid face, insisting shrilly that it was an outrage for gringo rules to spoil a perfectly good Mexican game like stud poker. The chief listened, curling his mustaches, his chest swelling with such importance of being the deciding factor in an argument involving such large sums of money. He looked at me. I said nothing, but bowed politely. He returned the bow. Then, turning to his policeman, he pointed a dramatic finger at the man at the table. "Arrest this goat," he said. It was a fitting climax. Shrieking and protesting, the unfortunate Mexican was led into a corner where he stood facing the table. "The money belongs to this gentleman," continued the chief of police. "As for you, you evidently do not understand the rudiments of this game. I have a mind—" "Perhaps," said Roberts, politely nudging me, "the Senor Captain would like to show the gentleman." "I should be only too glad to loan him a few chips," I added, raking in the pile. "Oiga," said the chief, "I will be glad to do so. Superlative thanks, sir." He drew up a chair, and out of politeness, the buck was given to him. "Abierto," he said, with an air of an owed hand. We played. The chief of police won. He rattled his chips like a professional gambler, slapping the buck to his neighbor, and we played again. "You see," said the chief of police, "it is easy if you observe the rules." He twisted his mustache, ruffled the cards, and pushed in $25. He won again. After some time, one of the policemen approached him respectfully and said, "I beg your pardon, mi capitan, but what shall we do with the prisoner?" "Oh," said the chief, staring. He waved his hand casually. "Just release him and return to your situations." Long after the last will had been spun on the roulette table, the lamps blown out, and the most feverish gambler ejected into the street, we sat playing in the poker room. Roberts and I were down to about 3 pesos apiece. We yawned and nodded with sleepiness, but the chief of police had his coat off and was crouched like a tiger over his cards. Now he was losing steadily. Chapter 2, Happy Valley. It happened to be the day of a fiesta, and of course, nobody worked in Valle Alegre. The cockfight was to take place at high noon in the open space back of Catarino Cabrera's drinking shop, almost directly in front of Dionisio Aguirre's, where the long-burrow pack trains rest on their mountain journeys, and the muleteers swap tails over their tequila. At one, the sunny side of the dry arroyo that is called a street was lined with double rows of squatting peons, silent, dreamily sucking their corn-husk cigarettes as they waited. The bibulously inclined drifted in and out of Catarino's, whence came a cloud of tobacco smoke and the strong reek of aguardiente. Small boys played leapfrog and with a large yellow sow, and on opposite sides of the arroyo, the competing roosters, tethered by the leg, crowed defiantly. One of the owners, an ingratiating businesslike professional wearing sandals and one cerise sock stalked around with a handful of dirty bank bills, shouting, "10 pesos, señores! Only $10! It was strange. Nobody seemed too poor to bet $10. It came on toward 2 o'clock and still no one moved, except to follow the sun a few feet as it swung the black edge of the shadow eastward. The shadow was very cold, and the sun white hot. On the edge of the shadow lay Ignacio, the violinist, wrapped in a tattered serape, sleeping off a drunk. He can play one tune when intoxicated, Tosti's Goodbye. When very drunk, he also remembers fragments of Mendelssohn's Spring Song. In fact, he is the only highbrow musician in the whole state of Durango. And possesses a just celebrity. Ignacio used to be brilliant and industrious. His sons and daughters are innumerable, but the artistic temperament was too much for him. The color of the street was red deep, rich, red clay, and the open space where the burrows stood, olive drab. There were brown crumbling adobe walls and squat houses, their roofs heaped high with yellow corn stalks or hung with strings of red peppers. A gigantic green mesquite tree with roots like a chicken's foot, thatched on every branch with dried hay and corn. Below, the town fell steeply down the arroyos. Roofs tumbled together like blocks, with flowers and grass growing on them, blue feathers of smoke waving from the chimneys and occasional palms sticking up between. They fell away to the yellow plain where the horse races were run. And beyond that, the barren mountains crouched tawny as lions, then faintly blue, then purple and wrinkled, notched and jagged across the fierce bright sky. Straight down and away through the arroyo one saw a great valley like an elephant's hide, where the heat waves buck jumped. A lazy smoke of human noises floated up. Roosters crowing, pigs grunting, burros giving great racking sobs, the rustling crackle of dried corn stalks being shaken out of the mesquite tree, a woman singing as she mashed her corn on the stones, the wailing of a myriad of babies. The sun fairly blistered. My friend Atancio sat up the sidewalk thinking of nothing. His dirty feet were bare except for sandals. His mighty sombrero was of a faded dull brick color, embroidered with tarnished gold braid, and his serape was of the pottery blue one sees in Chinese rugs, and decorated with yellow suns. He rose when he saw me. We removed our hats and embraced after the Mexican fashion, patting each other on the back with one hand while we shook the other. "Buenos tardes, amigo," he murmured. "How do you seat yourself. Very well, much thanks. And you? How have they treated you? Delicious, superlative thanks. I have longed to see you again. And your family, how are they? It is considered more delicate in Mexico not to ask about one's wife because so few people are married. Their health is of the best. Great, great thanks. And your family? Bien, bien. I saw your son with the army at Jimenez. He gave me many, many remembrances of you. Would you desire a cigarette? Thanks. Permit me a light. You are in Valle Alegre many days? For the fiesta only, senor. I hope your visit is fortunate, senor. My house is at your orders. Thanks. How is it that I did not see you at the baile last night, senor? You who were always such a sympathetic dancer. Unhappily, Juanita is gone to visit her mother in El Oro, and now, therefore, I am palatonico. I grow too old for the senoritas. Ah, no, senor. A caballero of your age is in the prime of life. But tell me, is it true that what I hear, that the Maderistas are now at Mapimi? Si, senor. Soon Villa will take Torreon, they say, and then it is only a matter of a few months before the revolution is accomplished. I think that, yes, but tell me, I have great respect for your opinion. Which cock would you advise me to bet on? We approached the combatants and looked them over, while their owners clamored in our ears. They set upon the curbing negligently, herding their birds apart. It was getting toward 3 in the afternoon. But will there be a cockfight? I asked them. Quien sabe, drawled one. The other murmured that possibly it would be mañana, but it developed that the steel spurs had been forgotten in El Oro, and that a small boy had gone after them on a burro. It was 6 miles over the mountains to El Oro. However, no one was in any hurry, so we sat down also. Appeared then Carolino Cabrera, the saloon keeper, and also the constitutionalist jefe politico of Valle Alegre, very drunk, walking arm in arm with Don Prisciliano Salcedes, the former jefe under the Diaz government. Don Prisciliano is a fine-looking, white-haired old Castilian who used to lend money to the peons at 20%. Don Catarino is a former schoolmaster, an ardent revolutionist. He lends money at a slightly less rate of usury to the same parties. Don Catarino wears no collar, but he sports a revolver and 2 cartridge belts. Don Prisciliano, during the first revolution, was deprived of most of his property by the Maderistas of the town, and then strapped naked upon his horse and beaten upon his bare back with the flat of a sword. "Ah, yeah," he says to my question. "The revolution, I have most of the revolution upon my back." And the two pass on to Don Prisciliano's house, where Catarino is courting a beautiful daughter. Then, with the thunder of hooves, dashed upon the gay and gallant young Jesus Triano, who was the captain under Roscoe. But Valle Alegre is a 3 days' ride from the railroad, and politics are not a burning issue there. So Jesus rides his stolen horse with impunity around the streets. He is a large young man with shining teeth, a ride and bandolier and leather trousers fastened up the side with buttons as big as dollars. His spurs are twice as big. They say that his dashing always and they say his dashing ways and the fact that he shot Emitario Flores in the back have won him the hand of Dolores, youngest daughter of Manuel Paredes, the charcoal contractor. He plunges down the arroyo at a gallop, his horse tossing bloody froth from the cruel curb. Captain Adolfo Melendez of the Constitutionalist Army slouches around the corner in a new bottle green corduroy uniform. He wears a handsome gilded sword which once belonged to the Knights of Pythias. Adolfo came to Valle Alegre on a 2 weeks leave, which he prolonged indefinitely in order to make himself a wife. To take himself a wife. The 14-year-old daughter of a village aristocrat. They say that his wedding was magnificent beyond belief. 2 priests officiating and the service lasting an hour more than necessary. But this may have been good economy on Adolfo's part, since he already had 1 wife in Chihuahua, another in Parral, and a 3rd in Monterey, and of course had to placate the parents of the bride. He had now been away from his regiment 3 months and told me simply that he thought they had forgotten all about him by this time. At 4:30, a thunder of cheers announced the arrival of the small boy with the steel spurs. It seems that he had got into a card game at El Oro and had temporarily forgotten his errand. But, of course, nothing was said about it. He had arrived, which was the important thing. We formed a wide ring in the open space where the burros stood, and the 2 owners began to throw their birds. But at the first onslaught, the fowl upon which we had bet all our money spread its wings, and to the astonishment of the assembled company, soared screaming over the mesquite tree and disappeared toward the mountains. 10 minutes later, the 2 owners unconcernedly divided the proceeds before our eyes, and we strode home well content. Fidencio and I dined at Charlie Cheese Hotel. Throughout Mexico, in every little town, you will find Chinamen monopolizing the hotel and restaurant business. Charlie and his cousin, Fu, were both married to the daughters of respectable Mexican villagers. No one seemed to think that strange. Mexicans appear to have no race prejudices whatever. Captain Adolfo, in a bright yellow khaki uniform and another sword, brought his bride, a faintly pretty brown girl with her hair in a bang, wearing chandelier lustres as earrings. Charlie banged down in front of each of us a quart bottle of aguardiente, and sitting down at the table, flirted politely with Senora Melendez, while Fu served dinner enlivened with gay social chatter in Pidgin Mexican. It seemed that there was to be a baile at Don Priquiliano's that evening, and Charlie politely offered to teach Adolfo's wife a new step which they had learned in El Paso called the turkey trot. This he did until Adolfo began to look sullen and announced that he didn't think he would go to Don Priquiliano's since he considered it a bad thing for young wives to be seen much in public. Charlie and Fu also tendered their regrets because several of their countrymen were due in the village that evening from Parral and said that they would, of course, want to raise a little Chinese hell together. So Fidencio and I departed after solemnly promising that we would return in time for the Chinese festivities after the dance. But we'll go ahead and end this episode there. Yeah. So, we are getting a good look at day-to-day life for everyone, more or less. In the first chapter there, they talked about gambling and everything that came with it. And apparently there were two types of 5-card stud. Mexican and American. This I did not know they left out the 7, 8, and 9s in the deck, so that's interesting. But yeah. Because the one guy was so used to playing 5-card stud in the Mexican style, he didn't realize that's not how it's played, because this is the American style hand. American deck, he should say. Because it had the 7, 8, and 9 cards still included in the deck. So, yeah. And it ended up being a reason to call the police. But, yeah. And then they are in the village of Valle Alegre. And even the constitutionalists and revolutionaries, even though they're on opposite sides, this is kind of a neutral town, more or less. So it's like, hey, we're just here to have an enjoyable time. Let that be that. But yeah. They also talk about having some wives as young as 14. And again, you all have to realize that. It don't make it right. But at that time, a younger wife of that age was not unusual. Putting the book back there. But yeah. And they, in fact, saw wives very differently. More of a only seen and not, definitely not heard. But some of them, a lot of them were even like, we didn't even want them to really be seen out in public. You know, they are our wives. Almost a bit regretful, you could say. But yeah.
But yeah, that's pretty much it for this episode. Hopefully, I can't guarantee, but hopefully we finish the book in the next episode, because we've just got a chapter and a half left. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, as always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.